Even though China is one of the fastest growing economies with a population of 1.4 billion and densely populated cities like Shenzhen and Shanghai, most Chinese youth are grappling with a serious problem: loneliness. Almost 23% of Chinese population reported experiencing loneliness in 2023, which was projected to reach 30% by 2030. Almost half of Gen Z population remained unmarried in 2023, nearly double the figure from 2 decades ago. And the Chinese government became so concerned that this trend could trigger a future population crisis, potentially reshaping the entire Chinese economy. Despite being a highly connected and densely populated country, why are so many Chinese people living in isolation? In this video, I want to understand why exactly China is growing lonely. Between the 1950s and 70s, China emerged from the mass famine of 1959. However, food shortages, limited housing, and lack of jobs were still widespread, but fertility rates remained very high. Families were having 5 to 6 children, which drove massive population growth, with the population approaching 1 billion in a relatively short period of time. Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping sought to contain this population explosion, believing that such a massive population would slow the country's development. In 1979, he introduced the one-child policy, which sharply drove down birth rates, but also created a new generation that is sometimes described as a lonely generation. These adults raised without siblings are now navigating a society with shrinking family networks, creating a significant challenge for the government and the country's economy. But why are these Chinese youth preferring to stay single with no kids and no family? When China rolled out the one-child policy, most families favored sons due to cultural norms, which left China with about 35 million more men than women, creating a huge gap and fueling intense competition in the marriage market. Several men, particularly those in rural or lower income groups, can't find partners. These men are expected to have an apartment, a stable high-paying job, and at least some savings to cover wedding costs. However, cities like Beijing and Shanghai have extremely high housing prices, while the cost of raising children is massive. Many men feel that if they can't afford marriage, there is no point in even trying. When only 3% of the population lived alone in the early 2000s, that figure has now risen to 23%. On June 10, 2025, a Chinese app called Slimy was published on the app market. Its job was to check whether the user was still alive every 48 hours. The app's name itself means "Are you dead?", which quickly climbed to become the top paid app in the country, designed for people who were worried about dying alone. However, the app vanished after a while, but its brief appearance exposed how loneliness is rapidly growing in urban China. Even though China being the second most populated country, why are so many people being pushed into lives of loneliness? There's also a connection that reveals how this massive loneliness could be the price China paid for decades of prosperity. Over the past 5 decades, China's economic boom transformed the country, making China the factory of the world. Hundreds of millions of people left their hometowns to work in distant cities. This urbanization not only created isolated private spaces for those, but it also delayed marriage and increased reliance on digital lifestyles. China introduced the nationwide hukou system in 1958, which not only restricted migrants' access to essential public services, but also erected social and economic barriers that separated families and communities. Every Chinese citizen has to be registered under either urban or rural hukou, which determines how easily they can access many public services such as public schools, healthcare, social welfare, housing benefits, and some local government services. Even if you move to another city for work, your benefits often remain tied to your registered hometown, unless you qualify to transfer your hukou, which can be difficult in major cities. For that reason, many workers leave their families behind and live alone in cities, which not only splits families but also deepens emotional distance between parents and their children. Because of this childhood separation, these children may struggle to establish a strong bond with their parents, which can later contribute to loneliness among elderly parents in old age. As China rolled out the hukou system and rapidly urbanized, millions of migrant workers, even though they were physically present in the city, remained socially disconnected from urban society. China has hundreds of millions of internal migrant workers. Many live in factory dormitories, work long hours, have few local friends, and most of them feel they don't fully belong in the cities where they work. Although surrounded by millions of people, many still experience social isolation. In April 2021, a 31-year-old factory worker named Luo Huizhong posted on a forum with a photo of himself laying flat on his bed, titled "Laying Flat is Justice." Millions of exhausted Gen Zs and millennial internet users transformed it into a massive national protest, exposing how the extreme 996 work culture had driven widespread burnout among young Chinese workers. As the new generation doesn't want to work anymore, they are losing interest in marriage, children, and traditional markers of success such as building a career, buying a house, and starting a family. This didn't just accelerate China's already falling birth rate, it also forced the Chinese government to intervene and encourage its citizens to produce more children. They removed the one-child policy and began incentivizing families with cash bonuses for second and third children, monthly childcare subsidies, tax deduction for families with kids, and housing discounts or priority access for those who wanted to produce more children. Some cities also offer thousands of yuan per year per child, along with one-time bonuses. But these incentives were too small compared to the actual cost of raising children, such as education, housing, and healthcare. After all, China's birth rate continued to decline, creating a solo economy instead of securing the traditional Chinese family structure. And this shift can be seen across the growing service sector, particularly businesses focused on solo individuals, such as restaurants offering solo dining tables, AI companions, and even Chinese women forming romantic relationships with AI-powered virtual partners to fill the emotional gap. For the elderly, the crisis is even more acute. Over 60% of Chinese seniors are empty nesters, living alone as their children migrate to cities for work. Many of those who live alone in public housing units are either single or have children who no longer live with them or support them. As a result, some may not receive medical treatment in time, some become depressed and eventually give up on themselves. In Hong Kong alone, more than 152,000 elderly individuals aged 65 and above were living alone according to the 2016 census. Many of them live in apartments where in some cases, their bodies may remain undiscovered for days until the neighbors notice a stench coming from the apartment and call the police. Chinese media have frequently reported that people who die alone often lose their lives to illness, injury, or self-harm. In Hong Kong alone, 1,019 self-harm casualties were recorded last year, with 43% of them being elderly individuals. Since records began in 1973, the rate of self-harm among people aged 60 and above has reached its highest level. But these are only the cases that were recorded. No one knows how many individuals die alone outside those records. The number of elderly people living alone was projected to rise from 1.3 million in 2019 to 2.5 million by 2039. And the biggest fear for these individuals is not dying alone, but that nobody will know when they die. In the big picture, we can see that China traded poverty for prosperity, but in the process, many traditional communities and family structures weakened. Even though Chinese families lived under one roof for centuries, a new solo culture has created a wave of individual living and freedom of choice, something already seen in countries like Japan and parts of Europe. What China achieved in just a few decades took many nations centuries to accomplish. Hundreds of millions escaped poverty, cities rose from farmland, and the country became an economic superpower. But beyond this extraordinary prosperity, loneliness has emerged as a new threat to the very economy China spent decades building.